Tuesday.
So today we're going to jump into creating successful experiences and the fact that there are practices or considerations that we have from a human factors perspective. And so we want to jump right into talking about those three perspectives that are necessary to create effective experiences.
Yep.
And that is number one, you've got to consider that entire ecosystem in which you're creating your solution, product, service, program, whatever that is. Apply systems thinking, which we've talked about in the past. So it's about considering the whole rather than the sum of the parts. So we'll talk
Parts.
about that as well. And the last one is collaborative design. So you got to have those other disciplines, perspectives, SMEs from other areas that come to the table in the design process.
Yep,
So,
absolutely.
so let's start with the ecosystem. It's not just about your user.
Right.
What's your perspective on that?
So I think what really kicked this whole discussion off was us talking about recently. We've been involved with a lot of things that aren't tangible
Hmm.
products, and what I mean by that is it's not software, it's not an interface, it's an approach that this by taking this approach, you can look at programs. A lot of the nonprofits we hear from, it's really not necessarily about an item, something you can touch or work with. So, yeah, you have to kind of look at all the parts. And we've been on many products where the focus was on that tangible, product, whether it be a medical device, whether it be a piece of software. Um, but what are all the components? What
Hmm.
is the system it lives in? There are people, there are cultural things going on that can impact programs or utilization of items. So
That's right.
that's my thought is there has to be due diligence to look at anything and everything that can impact that experience and success of whatever it is you're working on. And again, human factors can be applied to intangible things, not just what we're pretty much all
Mhm.
trained and accustomed to.
Yeah, yeah. And as I was doing a little bit of research in defining or understanding tangibles versus intangibles, software is considered an intangible, which is interesting. And so we've got to think about the fact that, and as I went kind of deeper into that, I recognized that with it being an intangible, you've got to understand the tangibles in that environment. Maybe it's how you serve up that software,
Yes.
that sort of thing. And so when we talk about that ecosystem, we've got to ensure that we put a definition around how big or what is. So, in elementary school science, we always look at the ecosystem within a pond or a lake and all the
Yep.
different organisms that live in that sort of environment. So, in that case, you're defining your ecosystem in terms of it being just the pond. But you could also define that ecosystem to be a little more broad in
Hmm.
terms of the area around that lake as well as the lake itself or that pond. Or you could make it the entire park. Or
Yes.
so you have to ensure that you define or put rails around what that ecosystem, how far out are the rails around what that ecosystem is or includes before you start the process of ideating and that sort of thing, because you've got to understand and explore each of those different areas. And if there are people involved, you've got to talk to parties that are a part of that entire ecosystem.
Absolutely. And I know later on we'll be talking about that. That goes back into the collaborative component of it. If you leave out an important part of that system,
Mhm.
it can make or break your program, your product. I do think of, medical devices we worked on, and there being it was, state of the art equipment that's out there, and all the focus is on that equipment and the end user, the one who
Mhm.
touches it. And where can things go wrong? Well, you have a patient, you have other support systems that will
Mhm.
also be interacting with that device or the outcome of what that device does. And if things start breaking down because you didn't recognize the importance or the role they play, yeah, you can have the most innovative idea, product, whatever it may be in the world, but if it's not adopted because of those other pieces in that system, well, we
Right.
know what happens. Yeah.
Well, you can also look at that as a factor or a determinant of success. And even
Yes.
though you may have been successful in creating that thing is its success is only defined more greatly by dissemination, usage, adoption, that sort of awareness. So all of those things are a part of that ecosystem. And stepping into the next stage of the creation process, it's about that system. So when you think
Yes.
about from a systems thinking perspective, and we talked about systems thinking in the past, all
Mm-hmm.
of the interrelated or interconnected components and parts of that ecosystem. So
Yep.
how do things work together? And I always like to think of the Gestalt principle. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So yes, you have to understand all of those pieces and parts, but you've got to understand more broadly that interrelatedness. So in the past, there, for example, we had a project where we were looking at a device installed on an OEM, um, on the OEM of a mobile phone.
Right.
And in that, what we recognized was that capability was similar to other capabilities that you may get in your browser on your mobile device or in a different app on your mobile device. And so, in evaluating that particular piece of technology within the device or that app within the device, what we recognized was in order to get a really clear understanding of user perception, user value of that
Mm-hmm.
solution, we have to look at the greater picture of that entire phone experience and those other things that may have either been more familiar, easier to find, more usable. And so all of those things together, it wasn't just about your capability, and it might be very useful, very
Yep.
helpful, but those other things might impede upon someone being able to either find or utilize your solution. So you've got to think about all those interrelated components and not forget that your tool or your system or your product alone is not the only thing that someone's interacting with.
Yes. And make sure you've defined and you go out and do the homework to figure out what is that system composed of.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a part where sometimes we all fall short, right? We get surprises because maybe we're not asking the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
We're not really looking at whatever it is you're working on as a system. It's a piece within the system.
Right.
And again, this is how it relates to even programs or services that are provided. And yeah, software is an intangible, which is very interesting, but they're things that really aren't. They're programs. I do think of that, Kenya. Lately, we're just seeing a lot of that with people trying to, how can you apply the same kind of thinking to a program, to its engagement, to its ultimate outcome? Well, again, are you breaking all those pieces down? Do you know everything that's influencing that program, and are you asking the right questions of the right people and then pulling it together to tell this story? And then you can start solutioning, right? Because then you can look at each component and how everything's interrelated and do much more fine targeting for each piece that's going to affect that final outcome. And the programs are a perfect example. Someone might not be the immediate consumer of your program or service, but downstream, there is someone or something happening socially.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that a lot lately, or within society that has impacted perceptions of different
Right.
programs or services. So how do you reach those people? What are the concerns? What's the bottleneck there? So it can get down to, messaging maybe all that's needed for some
Mhm.
parts of that system.
Mhm.
But you have to know what all of those elements are as best you can to even know how to tackle it. Because we have seen situations where you can do everything you want with a product or service or
Right.
the flow, but there are these other things out there that are having an impact on people's perceptions. I think AI is a really good example too. That you can have a great system, you're great machine learning, it's just giving all the right things, but there are a lot of preconceptions, and maybe that differs
Mhm.
based on whatever, it could be
Your user proficiency,
your,
their understanding of the technology,
yep,
that all of those things, the things that they've been told and how that might
yes,
bias them. I mean, there's so, to your point, that's a really good example.
yeah,
And yeah, you've got to keep all of that in mind, and it's bigger than your technology.
it's bigger than your technology.
And on the flip side of that, when you think about some solutions, especially when they are wrapped around or within a program that's wrapped around them,
Yeah,
technology today is a primary mechanism for disseminating services, information, capability. And you've got to not only understand what are the options in terms of technology, but what is your user's ability to navigate that technology to get
mm-hmm,
to the value.
mm-hmm, yep,
How do they even, how proficient are they? How do they use technology today? And are you finding ways to, I think about in East Africa and I think in India as well, they're using mobile banking as a way to transact where brick and mortar banking is very foreign in the way
yep,
that individuals transact with one another. And so you have to think about that entire system of people are using SMS technology more so than a banking app for a brick and mortar, or you've got to have a way for people to transact at some point where they load money or cash out. So you've got to have the physical stands in different areas. And how do I become a retailer in that space? So,
right,
that's an entire ecosystem that's been defined, but within that you've got to think about all of those systems of I am a shop owner and I'm trying to transact, and so I've got to not only think about my product, but how am I getting paid for it, how do I cash out and pay
yep,
bills and that sort of thing. So that's a huge uh, piece of how you solve for these types of things. And kind of the segue into the last part of that is in that solution or that definition and solution creation process, someone's got to facilitate or orchestrate getting all of those different perspectives. So we are not saying that human factors people have all the answers, but
right,
what we do have is the ability to facilitate extracting, identifying who might have those answers and how to facilitate the collection of those varied perspectives. How do you organize those different perspectives around what a solution looks like? What are the right questions to ask?
mm-hmm,
So we've got a collaborative design process.
yes. And then how do you take all of that data and
Mhm.
make sense of it? Again, in a collaborative fashion, but then having someone who can actually sit and start putting those pieces together
Mhm.
to make you realize, why does this plus this not equal this? Why
Totally.
is it equaling this? And I think that it's always helpful to have someone, because then that can drive experimentation from there. Okay, we've learned a lot about all these pieces in the system. Where do we think, where can we impact at each stage? Maybe there's one you're never going to be able to overcome, so you got to hone in on the other ones. But is it in messaging? Is it in awareness? I still
Mhm.
go back to a lot of the medical and even insurance work we've both done, where or providing services at least for those memberships, and where it truly became, there were multiple fronts that you could attack that would increase that engagement and that usage by not just focusing on that one kind of the most salient end user, let's say a surgeon who's going to be using
the
primary user. How do you influence it downstream? Whether it's through messaging, so you can get beyond a product, a tangible item, into more of those other components like messaging to whoever your primary user's end user is going to be, and the people and organizations they have to deal with. So
that's right. So you're looking at your primary stakeholders, but you're also your secondary, your indirect, all those different stakeholders that are involved. The last thing I'll say about this is when we zone in on that collaborative design piece, if you allow your technologists to focus or to be the facilitator of those conversations, just by the nature of how they think and what's their focus, it's going to be about the technology. If it's the program, that the value that program is defined around, if they're driving the conversation, they're going to focus on that program component. And the good thing about human factors is we are trained to look at all of those different pieces equally in that system thinking process. So all of those pieces, like you just said, organizing and putting the puzzle pieces together, we recognize that one is not more important than the other. They work together, and you have to figure out what is the symbiotic relationship that can be created around them. So to recap, sorry?
I just said fun times.
Yeah, so to recap, it's about that ecosystem. So it's not just about your users, it's defining or putting rails around what is that area of focus that might be just the pond, or the pond and the region around it, or the entire park. So you've got to be able to put rails around what is that particular ecosystem. Then you want to approach things from a systems thinking perspective and understand each of those parts, but then how they all kind of work together. And then finally, that collaborative design. So how do we consider all of the different SMEs and stakeholder perspectives, but make sure that we put them together like a puzzle to figure out what a solution can be?
Yes.
Awesome.
Good summary.
Yeah. So thank you so much for listening. You know where to find us if you have any questions. Otherwise, we will see you next week. Any ideas that you may have around topics of interest, please reach out, because we're always interested in sharing what we know around things of interest. Have a good week, and we'll see you next